QSO Today, episode 412, Richard Bateman, KD7BBC. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. I discovered Nuts and Bolts magazine at the Dayton Hamfest. It's a great read both online and in print form. See the link to Nuts and Bolts magazine on the QSO Today show notes page. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo returns on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The presentations are lining up for September, and we can still use more. In addition, we have a project gallery new to the expo where you can submit a presentation in the form of a paper, video, or slideshow to demonstrate your ham radio interest. I am working hard calling companies that create products and services to come to the expo, not only to support it financially, but to give our exhibition floor a wide and interesting variety. If you have a business that caters to our hobby and would like to get your product in front of hams at the expo, please contact me. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Richard Bateman, KD7BBC, smitten by computers and programming from an early age, used this talent to solve problems. Combined with an interest in amateur radio and driven by his family, Richard developed Exam Tools amateur radio testing software now used by the majority of volunteer examiners today. The COVID pandemic accelerated the evolution of Exam Tools for remote testing that is now used today. KD7BBC tells the story in this QSO Today. KD7BBC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Richard?
I'm here.
Richard, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. On your LinkedIn page, you say, quote, I specialize in making things work. I'm most interested in building reusable tools and solving problems in ways that prevent others from having to reinvent the wheel, as I have had to do, unquote. How did this approach to life begin for you?
When you're trying to summarize your approach to things in one sentence, it's always an interesting challenge. I started programming at a very young age. I was apparently quite a weird kid. I understand that a lot better now that I have my own kids that are the same type of age. But I remember starting programming just with, basic.
How old would you say that you had your first exposure to technology, including computers?
5 or 6 is when my dad managed to get some kind of a PC from work. He was a transmitter engineer for what is now BYU Broadcasting, KBYU. My father, AC7DM, was WB7ESH at the time. And I was aware that he was a ham radio operator, but didn't really know much about it at the time. Somehow, and I don't even remember at this point how, I got really interested in making the computer do things. And he showed me how to make a batch file. And so I made a batch file menu system, probably when I was, I think, six years old, that just echoed out or printed, or I think it's echo. It's been a long time. The menu, and then I made batch files for like each of the commands, and just copied the menu that he had there for running applications. And then he saw that I did that, and he showed me a few other things and how to make it all one batch file, and played with that a fair bit. And then sometime in the next year, it stuck in my head for a long time that I learned BASIC when I was about 7. I wasn't doing super interesting things. The thing that I wrote the most was what I called paint, which was nothing more than just you press keys that moves a block around on the screen and it doesn't clear it. And so it's just basically making ASCII art with, just moving it around. And that project went through some crazy, crazy iterations, where at one point I had a version, this is when I was probably 12 or 13, that a neighbor helped me write in C that actually supported having a monochrome display and a color display, and you can go off one and onto the other. Multiple screens has always been a fascination of mine, long before it was practical, and we added mouse support and, crazy stuff like that. But, so I started in a lot of ways, it was kind of a solution looking for problems. I was fascinated with being able to make the computer do things, but I was also too young and inexperienced to figure out how to do that.
If you had a question, you went to your father for answers, or did you have other mentors, other adults, or maybe even friends who could help you, or you worked together with?
Mostly at that point, it was just me. I mean, my father definitely gave me some information about, and helped me get started. But like with BASIC, it was mostly I was looking at the help files. And then later I learned Turbo Pascal 3, and I used to fall asleep reading the reference manual under my covers when I was maybe 10 or 11, something like that. And like I said, I was a very strange child.
What was the hometown?
Orem, Utah, south of Salt Lake. If anyone knows where BYU is, Brigham Young University is in Provo, which is just barely south. So Orem is just north of that. It's in kind of the middle of Utah County.
Orem, Utah is close to BYU, Brigham Young University, so it's a university town?
Orem isn't so much. Provo definitely has kind of become a university town. Orem is more the town next to the university town, if that makes sense.
It's the bedroom community.
I guess, kind of. WordPerfect came from Orem. The WordPerfect campus was actually just down the street from my house growing up. Yeah, Novell in Provo.
And what were the opportunities for a 12-year-old Richard in terms of once you're learning Turbo Pascal 3? Did more doors open for you?
Slowly. I mean, as far as external doors, more, like I said, I had a solution. I was looking for problems. So at one point, there was actually a play-by-email role-playing game that my father and brother and I got involved in. I ended up writing a mail server for that in OS2 Rex, which most of your listeners have probably never heard of. It was a fairly simple programming language, but as far as I know, it was only ever really used in OS2. And I was basically tying into an email system that we had there. And when mail would come in, it would get dropped in a directory, and my script would pick that up and then parse it onto a web page and also send out emails to people who were subscribed to it. And so I kind of built my own, mail server that took things in and then, and made it available so you could read and post on the website, but you could also participate via email. And in a lot of ways, I think that was my first real experience with the concept of reinventing the wheel and the good idea, bad idea on that, because a couple years, we used that for, I don't know, maybe a year. It seems like a long time in my memory, but to a 12-year-old, that probably may not have been that long of a time. I think it was maybe a year or two that we used that before my father found, and this was all running on a web server on my father's computer at BYU because he had a public IP address, so we could do that. And then he found an off-the-shelf free system that did all of that for us. And he and my brother were super excited with how powerful this thing was. And I saw that, and little 12-year-old me went into my bedroom and sobbed because this project that I'd spent all of this time on was no longer going to be useful. I'm not even sure if I can see at this point how much of an impact that had on me. I mean, looking back, it was kind of silly. But at the time, it was devastating because it was this project that I really spent a lot of time on because somebody else made something better and it was free. And it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense to use that. Of course you would. And so I think after that, I maybe started looking a little more carefully at the projects that I spent much time on.
While you were going to school, what was the support for this interest from the school? Did you have computers in the classroom? Did you have a computer room? What kind of support did you get for this interest from your school?
Not a lot of direct interest or direct help, but kind of some. Well, so when I was in, eighth grade, I don't even remember how old that makes me. There was a computer lab. We took some computer classes, which were so incredibly easy for me at the time that it was just, because they were all beginning stuff and I'd been playing with things for a long time. But I met 3 or 4 other people, Ben, Scott, Mike, and Josh, who is now Omni, who are all actually ham radio operators now, and a couple of whom I still interact with frequently. And we became lab assistants to the computer, at the computer lab. And kind of ended up running a lot of the student side of the network at our junior high school through 8th and 9th grade. We'd set up the labs. We had administrator access on the student side. We couldn't on the teacher side, of course. That's where the grades were kept. And we, did some dumb things and did some smart things and caused trouble, but also helped a lot.
So this is the 90s version of the AV assistants. In the 60s and 70s, the nerdy kids were the AV guys. And I'm assuming that in the 90s, it progressed to the computer lab.
Yeah, it was probably about the same thing. We were the ones that when a teacher's computer stopped working or, something wasn't working, we'd get called in and sometimes managed to get some extra privileges from our teachers who knew that we'd fix their computers for us. Not any help with grades or anything like that. But, it was an interesting time with just kind of this interesting, the four of us were kind of in our own little world there. Just being lab assistants in the library, which was the center of the network, because that's where the server towers were and everything, and learned how to use Novell NetWare and learned how to set things up. And that wasn't much programming, but it was it was kind of where my interests went during that time period, because it was the only thing really available to me at the time as far as as far as directed or assisted, or, when you're working on something like that, mostly by yourself, a lot of things just end up being driven by what can you find that needs to be done. Anyone can take and write some pointless project, but unless there's some, at least I've found for me, unless there's some goal that you're working towards or some problem that you're trying to solve, it's hard to stay focused and interested on it. Thinking back, I know I was still programming, I was still doing some web development, but I wasn't really, I can't think of any projects that I did during that particular time period that stick out. However, it was only, and then when we went to high school, which in my city was 9th or 10th grade, we were no longer with that. And I did take some programming classes there, which were basically boring because I already knew how to do almost everything. My teacher did give me some extra projects now and again to challenge me. I remember learning about recursion, playing with blocks on the floor with my mother one evening. That was actually a fun memory. Learning to solve the Towers of Hanoi problem. And literally, my mom and I sat there with blocks. My mother is an extremely intelligent individual who probably could be a software developer if she had the time to spend on it. KD7BBC, actually. She's also licensed. Anyway, it was, I think, 10th or 11th grade is when I started actually studying for my ham radio license.
You mentioned that your father is already a ham radio operator when you have this beginning interest in computers and computing and programming. Was that interest in amateur radio displayed at home? Did he have a station at home that he used, or while you were programming, he was doing ham radio? Was there any ham radio activity actually going on at home?
There was for a while. So as best I can remember, when I was, I'm guessing 5, 6, 7 years old, somewhere in that time frame, he had a packet node running MSys. If anyone has been around long enough to remember what that is. I remember one time finding that the clock on his computer was wrong, and so I fixed it for him, and he was not pleased about that. I believe it was probably, looking back now, I think it was probably set to UTC because it probably needed to be for that. And so he had packet radio stuff and was doing that for quite a while. And he had a handheld, but I believe he sold it at some point, decided he wasn't using it enough, and he actually sold it so that he could buy a monitor. So you could get a VGA screen for our computer at the time, because he couldn't afford to do both. And so for quite a few years, there wasn't really a lot of that. But I remember talking with him. So I mentioned he was the transmitter engineer for KBYU, and I used to go up to the transmitter site up on a mountain peak in Salt Lake with him anytime he'd let me do it. And so we'd talk, just driving to and from, and we got talking about packet radio, especially. I've always been very interested in networking and, really communication with computers and interfacing things and interfacing things together has always been a little bit of a passion of mine, making things work together that don't normally work together. And so the idea of being able to network computers over the radio was just super, super exciting to me, which is ironic because I've never set up a packet radio station in my life at this point. But that is what was interesting to me. And I don't remember at what point in my life I was talking to him about that. But that was one of the things I was like, hey, I should get a ham radio license because then I could try this. But then it was actually a couple of my friends, I think originally Don, Matt, and Steve, KC7ZAX, KC7ZAZ, and I don't know if Matt ever got licensed. Anyway, but Steve's dad was a ham. I don't even remember his call sign, but they started studying for theirs, and they had the Now You're Talking ARRL book, and they got licensed. And so I was like, yeah, if they can do it, I can do it. And I started studying for my tech and got and I borrowed their book and sort of studied it for 4 or 5 months and eventually got licensed that way.
So your first license was technician class license?
Yes, it was at the time the technician no code license.
What was your first call sign?
KD7BBC. I still have it.
So you went straight to technician. That was the no-code technician class license. Do you remember what year that was?
Well, let's see. It's 2022 now. I renewed my license for the second time maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So it's been about 25 years, 96, 97, 95, something like that. It was before they dropped the other license classes. So I did have to take the novice and the technician. And then I remember not too long after that, because once I got back into ham radio, my dad decided to get back into it. And he had stopped at technician because 5 words a minute was as good as he had managed to do on the Morse code. And so when they decided they were going to drop all of that and make everything 5 words a minute, he went and he actually, right before they changed everything, he went and took his general and advanced and extra. And then as soon as the code went away, which was like, he did this right on the edge. So it was basically right away. The code requirement dropped to 5 words a minute for all of the others. And so then he upgraded straight to amateur extra and went from WB7ESH to AC7BM because it was less of a mouthful. He always felt like his call sign was a little too long.
So now you're 15 years old. I think 15 puts you in the 9th, 10th grade. And you have a license. Your friends have a license. Did you play ham radio in high school? Was there a club at your high school? Did you start a club?
So there wasn't anything at the high school, but I did start helping out with, basically I got on the radio. I've had a friend whose dad had a handheld that wasn't used much, and they let me borrow it. And I borrowed it probably a lot longer than I should have. But it was a Yaesu FT411, I believe. And I used to I'd be walking down the street with a half-wave telescoping antenna talking on a repeater in Salt Lake. And then I find out about events that I could help with, and I started helping with those, and I got my dad to come help with them. And then most of the rest of my siblings ended up getting licensed as well and started helping the same. And so that was kind of where I started, is helping with. We helped with the March of Dimes, Walk America, with the Freedom Festival, July 4th Parade, and a couple of ultra marathon races, which I still help with. In fact, one of them is this Saturday.
Which one is that?
That's the Kachinomosa 100K ultra marathon. It's got something like 15,000 combined feet of climb, and it goes up over Squaw Peak, just the mountains around this valley. A lot of areas where there is no cell coverage at all. The only way you can get in there is with ham radio.
You're being involved in these activities. It sounds to me like you must have belonged to a club or joined a club in order to be a part of these events, because these events were organized by someone, were they not?
So initially I was just helping out with whatever events I could find, and I think most of those were organized by the Utah County Aries group, which I've kind of joined, but I think they consider me a member, but I don't go to a lot of their things. I just know all of them really well and help out a lot. There was a Utah County Explorer Post, which is the group that was mainly coordinating those 2 ultra marathons. And I did end up joining that. Helped out with I I joined that because they were the ones doing the security for the Scout Jamboree in 2000, which was a huge, huge event. And we did all the security, we did communications, and it was 3 days of out in the boonies and figuring out how to charge our radios in weird locations and running off of AA packs, and it was a lot of fun. And as an interesting side note, I was actually in that group and coming up to that event that I first met Soraya Whitehead, who is now Soraya Bateman and is my wife, KC7KEI. We didn't start dating for almost I think it was another 8 or 9 years, but that is where we first met, is through that, and it was through amateur radio events that we both helped with that we both kept running into each other over the next 8 or 9 years. Her father, incidentally, is the one who administered all four, because I did take the 5 words a minute code, all 4 of my license exams. And as soon as I became an amateur extra, my father and I both joined his VE testing team. And it's it was at the time the only one in Utah County. There was a couple in Salt Lake, and there was that one in Utah County for getting your radio license. And so I'd been part of that for quite a few years as well.
Did this interest in computing and amateur radio, did it lead to the decisions that you made for furthering your education and career?
That's a harder one to pinpoint. It certainly had an impact on my career, but I'm not sure how much. It's hard to say how much it had a kind of a directing impact on my career. I got a job with doing software development first when I was 17. I'd actually done a couple of kind of contract work, affiliate jobs for some little companies doing some web design. But it was really more the programming that I was interested in, not just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And so it was a neighbor who was a computer science teacher at BYU told me, he's like, hey, you've been doing programming a long time. I know you think you're too young. Nobody would hire you, but give it a try. Here's the BYU job board. Go there. See if you can find anything. Try calling some of them. Maybe you'll find a job. To my shock, I did. And that's kind of a funny story that's not worth going into right now. But long story short is that there were 2 college kids who were running the company I joined. One of them is still a coworker today. And he actually originally wanted to let me go because he didn't feel like his partner had done a good job of screening me, but decided to have me help with one project that they were doing, and then was so impressed with me that he kept me even when they later split the company and went their separate ways. And I've stayed in contact with him for a long time. But I was actually working with him, for him, when I got my general, which was the point where I first started wanting to make ham radio study related tools.
Did you end up going to college or university in computer science, or have you been able to bypass the higher education and just go right into software development in companies?
The answer is yes to both questions. So I do have a computer science degree, bachelor's in computer science. By the time I got that, I was actually working part-time for Facebook the last year of my college career. They made a half-serious attempt to convince me to drop out of college and come and move to California and work for them. But I didn't feel like that would be the best for my family because I was married by then. So I worked in the computer science industry as a software engineer for about 10 years before I went back and got serious about school. And I had to really work because I was actually on academic probation when I started getting serious about it. I had to take my cumulative GPA from something like 1.8 to 3.6 in 2 semesters is what ended up happening because I'd taken it that lightly before and kind of dropped out. And it was then after some of my experiences working where there were some opportunities that I lost because I didn't have a degree despite my experience. But then by the time I actually got the degree, my experience has been far more meaningful. And GradeCam, which is where my primary quote unquote real job still is, though I dropped to part-time, which I'm sure we'll cover later. But I didn't start until after I actually graduated, but like straight out of college, because I didn't have time to work for them before that. He would have liked to have me work for them sooner, but that was as soon as I could start doing it. And so the first year I worked for GradeCam, I was actually still working part-time for Facebook, which was an interesting combination between the two.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. What was the Fire Breath project?
So Fire Breath, there was one point in 2005, I left the country for a couple of years doing a service mission for my church. And I actually spent those years in Russia, so I speak fluent Russian as a random side note. And when I came back from that, basically all of the places that I'd been working before were gone, and a lot of my experience was woefully out of date because I hadn't done really anything with a computer the whole time I was out there. And so I started working for a company called Move Networks, which is now Dish Digital, and they did streaming television, and they used a browser plugin for that. Now, for most people don't really know the difference between browser plugins and extensions because technically the names mean the same thing. But basically, there was it's almost unheard of now, but there was a way of interfacing using either ActiveX or it's called NPAPI, where you write C++ or native code that interfaces with the browser and you can talk to it from JavaScript. And Move Networks used a lot of that. And I was really fascinated by that. And I started out on a JavaScript team, and I kind of just was so interested in the plugin stuff that I wheedled my way into figuring out how to build it and started playing with it more, and eventually ended up writing a framework to solve a lot of the problems that I felt we had with the plugin in order for it to make it integrate more seamlessly between JavaScript and that. And so for probably close to 10 years, Firebreath was one of the best known ways to build cross-platform browser plugins, especially if you wanted to work on Mac, Windows, and Linux with just one code base. And so it was all in C++, and it used a lot of crazy stuff like templates and metaprogramming, and so that was it was a really big part of it. It's why I was working for Facebook as my expertise with that. It's why GradeCam hired me originally, and then interestingly, at this point, it's the browsers have pretty much all removed support for it, and so you can't even do that style of programming anymore. So to a certain extent, it's almost like it was this really big thing, and now it's useless. But there's other technologies, there's other ways of doing that I've moved on to. And my continued work with GradeCam has let me keep playing with those, and we've found other ways to bring it in, compiling the native code and doing things, to WebAssembly so you can run it in the browser, and then doing other things to interface that so you can get the camera stuff. And anyway, it's a topic I could talk about probably by itself for like an hour.
We'll get back to amateur radio, but I'd just like you to talk a little bit about GradeCam, which you're doing now about, 50% time, what that project is or what they do, and then we'll go back to amateur radio. What is GradeCam?
The way I learned about it was kind of the CEO had been using, at the time, basically GradeCam had one developer. They'd had more and then ended up downsizing as they were trying to figure out exactly what they're doing. The CEO, Rob Porter, NE6U, incidentally, was at the time just transitioning back from, as he was finishing his doctorate in physics, and had been using Firebreath to integrate their scanning technology in the browser. And so I'd actually worked with him a little bit on IRC, helping him out with some of the stuff. And their core technology is one that allows you to use a computer webcam and scan a bubble answer sheet and just read the results of that. And he originally created it in order to help his mother, who was a teacher at the time, in order to kind of to automate data entry in a lot of ways. And then later also to be able to start collecting all of the information that's increasingly being required of, teachers have to know how you're doing on all of these core standards and all of these other stuff and all of this information that they're required to gather that they mostly are not given tools to do that with. And so we took that and we started building onto it. And GradeCam has evolved a little bit to be less just focused around that core technology, which is still, they've got the best technology of that type that's on the market as far as I'm aware.
When we're talking bubble forms, we're talking about things like Scantron. You take a standardized test and you're using a soft pencil to fill in the bubbles.
Scantron, the reason that everyone in the world knows what a number 2 pencil is. It's a lot less finicky than Scantron in a lot of ways. Like you don't have to use a number 2 pencil. In fact, a Sharpie will actually work better, but you can. The thing a lot of people who aren't teachers don't know about Scantron is that they make their money on the forms. They try to make their scanning equipment, and you have to have a special Scantron machine to scan it, but they make that relatively inexpensive, and then, those forms will be like 20 cents to $1 each. So GradeCam, you can actually just print it out. And it did start out as just bubbles. The current version of GradeCam actually can do handwriting recognition and, capture things. We're looking into some other stuff in the future that I probably shouldn't talk about because then the salespeople will yell at me. But yeah, so it's kind of that basic type of a thing. And in fact, my testing tools can actually use GradeCam to do amateur radio license exams to grade those.
Well, anybody that's married to a teacher, as I am, know that the integration between teachers and paper to computers is a very slow evolutionary process. So I'm sure that a product like GradeCam is welcome relief.
It's been around for a long time, but as you know, it's like technology fatigue with everyone comes up with this new technology, and how do you decide if it's worth the time to figure it out and to learn it and stuff. One of the big things that, when I'm just talking about GradeCam that I tell people is that GradeCam was designed to work with the way that you are doing things already. We have some what they call one-to-one products, which means where all the students are on a computer. And this probably sounds strange coming from me, given how focused on technology that I am and how much I prefer to work on a computer than paper in basically all situations. But there's a lot of studies that show that using paper is actually better for the students, to not have them on the screen as often, to not have as much technology, because it can distract them more as well. But you still need to gather that information into a computer. And that's the thing that I think I've enjoyed the most about GradeCam, is that it's been very focused on identifying the roots of the problems that the teachers are facing, and then providing just what is needed to solve that, and finding ways to make it so that you can use that however you're doing it. And I've tried to to apply a lot of those same lessons to the exam tools and Hamstudy stuff that I do as well.
So let's get back to amateur radio. So one of the things that you mentioned a little while back was that you got involved in VE testing. And VE testing, for the audience that isn't aware, is volunteer examiner testing. I'm a volunteer examiner. You can become a volunteer examiner through the ARRL. There's other organizations that also support volunteer examiners.
There are 14 volunteer examiner coordinators in the United States.
And that speaks probably to the success that they're having bringing ham radio operators into the hobby. The question is that you got involved in doing volunteer exams. What was the problem that you saw in the way that volunteer exams were administered that led you to coming up with a solution?
Initially, it was because this was a long evolution, but initially it was a simple one of, I hate filling out forms. And so our team was probably more evolved than a lot of the teams at the time, possibly because we had one of the highest throughputs of any VE team at the time, and honestly still. I mean, we were for a while doing probably 60 to 80 applicants through our test session per month.
This is the local area.
Yes. Yeah, this is all in person. In fact, it may down a little bit now, but like before COVID started, and for the last 20 years, my father-in-law, NV7V, Steve Whitehead, has been W5YI-VEC's highest testing. It tested more applicants than any other team, with the next highest being the team in Salt Lake, just north of us.
What do you think drove those numbers? We're always talking in ham radio about how we're not getting enough people becoming members of the hobby. I mean, what drives those numbers in Salt Lake City or in Utah?
A lot of it is, I think it's a combination of culture and environment. For one thing, on the more pragmatic side, in Utah, we have mountain ranges and canyons that people drive to all the time that have no cell service, because there's no cost-effective way to get cell service in there. One of the repeaters that I maintain gets onto the side of Timpanogos, which is a little more likely people may have heard of. It's a fairly tall mountain in the Rocky Mountains, and it's right in the middle of Utah and Salt Lake counties. I mean, there's a lot of Timpanogos that you can't get any cell access into that these repeaters are able to get into, and that's one of the main reasons that we maintain those. And so there's a lot more actual practical right now need for ham radio in Utah than there is in some other areas. And the other thing is largely due to the local predominant religion, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Everyone is, I won't say everyone, but there's a much higher focus on emergency preparedness. So, I mean, the term has become preppers. To a certain extent, people in Utah have been preppers for a very long time. There's the local recommendation is to have a year's supply of food storage on hand at all times, is the guidance from the church leaders, just in case of emergencies, and to enable you to weather any problem. And ham radio plays into that extremely well, because ham radio is, as we saw, like when the World Trade Center went down, as you see, anytime there's a big natural disaster, or for example, when a football game gets let out, the cell service does not handle everyone who could be on it trying to use it at the same time. It's just not that type of infrastructure can't handle the volume. I heard at some point that it's something like 10% of the devices on the network is all it can handle, and I'm not sure if that number is actually accurate. It wouldn't surprise me if that number is high. It may be lower than that. And so, there is an understanding that if things go wrong and the infrastructure is down, even if it's just for a few days, you need some way of communicating. Ham radio is an excellent way to do that. And since we have so many areas around here where ham radio is the only thing that you can use, it's very easy to point out and be like, well, look, this is how I use it all the time, that cell phones don't solve this problem. And anytime you have a problem that's actually a concrete problem, even if it's a concrete, this may happen, it may not happen, but if it's something that you can actually see that, hey, there are things that do happen that show the benefit of this, it makes it a little bit more visible why this might be useful.
That was a great answer. And I steered you off the track slightly on why you started down the road of trying to make the testing process better. But now we understand that out of sheer volume, I can imagine when I've done some VE sessions that the paperwork for 4 people is a lot of work. And I would imagine if you're doing a volume of, 50, 60 a month or at a session, that's a lot of work. So what did you dream up and what was the solution?
To add to that, it's uncommon for us to have more than maybe 5 or 6 VEs at any session. I know that there are some testing groups that they've got 12 VEs or 15 or 20 VEs or, some larger number of VEs, and it's not uncommon to have more VEs than applicants. I've done test sessions with just 3 VEs where we had 50 people. And so is that kind of thing is like, and I don't want to write that much. So the first version of anything that I wrote for testing stuff, which was probably back in like 99, 2000, something like that, was all it did is I typed things in and it printed out onto the CSCE. And then later on, I expanded that, or later on, actually, W5YI changed to a 3 carbon copy CSCE method. I'll be honest, part of this was probably me wanting my software to still be useful. I changed it so instead of printing onto the CSCE, it printed onto the 605.
What is a CSCE?
The CSCE is the Certificate of Successful Completion of Examination. And per Part 97 rules, after an applicant passes an exam element, the VE team is required to issue them a CSCE, which acts as proof that they passed it. To be honest, that's usually not really an issue anymore, since exams, licenses are issued so much faster than they used to be. When I took it, it took 4 weeks, and that was still, everyone was telling me how much faster that was than when they took it. And these days, it's often within a week, or for people using my system, it's often like the next day. Well, except for now there's also the FCC exam fee that you've got to pay after that day. Anyway, but the point is that's, so the CSCE is required, even if it's often not really necessary. It gives you something to hang on your wall, if nothing else.
And then the 610 is the FCC form 610.
605.
Oh, 605, I'm sorry.
And that's actually not the FCC form, though that's a common misconception. The FCC does have a form 605, which is really long and really annoying, and every single person listening to this to this podcast should be very, very grateful that they never had to fill it out. So what happens is the FCC has given the VECs permission, or actually it's NCVEC, I guess kind of both. NCVEC is the National Volunteer Examiner Coordinators. Basically, it's the committee of all of the VECs is NCVEC. And they are the ones who actually make the question pools, by the way. It is not the FCC. So they make their own version of the 605, and a few of the other VECs, like Laurel VEC, have their own version as well, because there was something they didn't totally like about the official NCVEC one, and because that's fine as long as it's got the information. That is, in theory, the actual form that is the application for your license is the 605 form. And so the CSCE goes to the applicant, the 605 form goes to the VEC, and then the VEC actually submits it to the FCC electronically at this point. And then the FCC well, now processes the application into their system, sends you the email saying, hey, you need to go pay your $35 fee, and then issues the license once that's done.
So this software that you've developed then has evolved over time, right? So what does it do now?
So, like I said, I started with just those, and then at some point, and this was after I got back from Russia, as I was looking at it, and I got talking to Larry Pollock, who's the head of W5Y IVEC, and got permission from him to do our own practice, our own exam software. Previously, we'd been using some Windows software from them, but I wanted to be able to automate more of this. And so after getting that permission, I built a system that could actually generate the exams. I'd already long since built something to convert the question pools into a format that my software could work with. Not intending to do this, I just had a very simple, like, print out all the questions and highlight them thing that I wrote that for. But so I took that and then started doing practice exams. And then it kind of expanded from there. So it started out with not practice exams, started out with just being able to administer the exams. Then once we were administering the exams anyway, then I could just go ahead and print out the 605s as well. And if we waited until after you did the exams, it could fill out the whole thing. We knew who the VEs were. We knew we knew the applicant information. And so then I expanded that to let you so people would register ahead of time, so it would have all that information, and then it printed out all the paperwork, and then I added on GradeCam support. And most of this actually came out in 2014. And then about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I don't know, however long it's been, in March of 2020, suddenly everybody was social distancing.
I have some questions because, I'm thinking of when I was doing some VE testing. We got software from the ARRL that would allow us to generate and print tests with the questions. So if I had 5 people, I could get 5 different tests with 5 different questions, 5 sets of questions that were all different so that if you were sitting next to somebody, you weren't copying.
Right.
What did yours do different? Now, you can actually set up a bunch of notebook computers or computer terminals or something like that, and these tests are now taken online? Or do you still print hundreds of pages for 60 people and they take it using paper?
Whichever you prefer at this point. So originally, I just built it for our test session, right? And ours was already doing a computerized exam. And so originally I built something that just, you took it online, not remotely. You still had to be there in person. And one of the VEs had to start and stop your exam using their call sign and a session password. And so it would track their history. It would generate the answer key, the test results, so that you could validate that the exam was generated correctly and how they did. And then after a bit, I integrated GradeCam with it, which meant that it needed to be able to print directly. Now, when I did that, I was actually also working with GLARG, GLAARG, which is the Greater Los Angeles Area Radio Group, which is another of the VECs. And I had met Norm Goodkin of GLARG. Honestly, at this point, I don't even remember how we met. But one of the times I was in California at GradeCam, I managed to meet up with him and have dinner. So I kind of knew him. And they needed a new test generation tool. And so I built something for them that could generate exams matching their answer keys. And it would randomize the questions, randomize the answer order, but make sure that the answers met their automatic grading key, which is not a terrible way of doing it. But I've always felt that to really make an exam, to have the level of exam integrity that I feel should be there, and I'll admit I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, I felt that each exam should be completely unique, should have a completely unique answer key, etc. And both the computerized method and the GradeCam method allow that. So the way and so to do that, I did create an exam generator where you can print the exams. And I think at this point, just about everybody is using it.
So the preferred method is to actually print the exam, hand those out?
I mean, preferred depends on who you talk to. That's not my preferred method.
But if you were looking around at where your software is being used, are most of these tests still being printed?
Assuming that there are not a whole bunch of exam generators that I don't know about, I think most exams are people who use exam tools are being printed. And most of the people doing that don't really understand what exam tools is or what it can do. They just know that that's where ARRL or W5YI, well, W5YI has been pushing the full capabilities more, but they know that that's where their VEC told them, go here, set up an account, get your account verified, and use this to print your exams.
So let me ask another question then. If you were a big club, that maybe is processing a lot of applications every month, maybe you might own a bunch of Chromebooks or something like that, computers to be able to set up a testing room, or was this software also intended for bring your own device so that if a person wanted to test electronically, they could bring their laptop and then they could access your system in order to be able to take their test on their device under the supervision of a VE?
So you can do that. You can do bring your own device. I actually do not recommend it. I know teams that do that. If you are going to do that, you need to make sure that you have very close observation, and especially that it is possible to observe the applicants without them being certain if you are observing them without looking around and being very obvious. And the reason I say that is because the one time that I, in almost 20 years of helping with exam sessions, that I've caught somebody cheating, it was because we allowed them to use their own device. It was we'd just moved to a new lab where we didn't have the computers and we hadn't collected up a collection of laptops or tablets yet. And he had a Linux machine running with a Dvorak keyboard, and I think he just figured that nobody else would know how to use his computer. They wouldn't be able to tell if something else was going on. And his scores were he was a little slow taking the exam, and his scores were a little too perfect. And I'll tell you, it's the easiest way to tell. The first thing you should be suspicious of if you think somebody might be cheating is if it takes them a long time to take the exam and it's a really good score, because looking up questions takes a lot longer than people realize. And so we were a little suspicious, and we managed to catch it. But the problem is he was sitting in the back row in a classroom that you couldn't easily walk behind. And so he just wouldn't switch screens if somebody was behind him. But somebody managed to catch a view through a door window where they could see his screen without it being obvious, and they saw him flipping. And so then I walked over and confronted him. And unfortunately for him, I know how to type using the Dvorak keyboard, and I know Linux quite well. And so I was able to see what was going on, and we disqualified him and reported it. And it was honestly, it was kind of emotionally devastating to me because I liked the guy. He was such a good guy, and I felt guilty because I think that we made it easy enough that, there's the expression keeping honest people honest. And I think there's a lot of truth. There's a lot of people who can convince themselves that it's not that big of a deal. And if there's no risk, then I'll just go ahead and do this. And I think that that's what happened. If we'd put a better system in place, he wouldn't have been tempted to do that. He probably still would have passed at least the tech exam, which is what he came for. It wouldn't have happened. So it's like he's the one who cheated, but I kind of felt responsible. A lot of teams will actually, it's very popular to use the Amazon Fire tablets. The software will work on even a 2017 version.
Right, because they're cheap. They're under $100, right?
I've seen them for $20. An 8-inch tablet for $20 that'll run this, or a 10-inch for $30, $35.
So your testing group would buy a bunch of them then, so that you're using your own devices for the testing.
And then there's kiosk software that you can add on if you want to be extra certain. But then the other thing you can do is even if you can't afford all of those, so do that, and then also have paper exams that you use GradeCam, because you don't have to pick either one. The system will allow both, and you can do what is commonly referred to as a hybrid session, where you give people who want tablets, you give them tablets, you run out of tablets, you say, well, you want to wait for a tablet, you want to just take a paper exam. And if you've got 50 unique exams that you just printed out and you keep reusing them, then that's enough diversity that you probably are not going to need to print a unique one for every applicant for every exam session, because those are going to last you quite a while. And you cycling through them, you're not going to have duplicates. really easily. But honestly, paper is not that expensive these days, and you can print them double-sided. And so, I think my team has actually been, for some reason, the VEs who are mostly helping these days, because I haven't had time in the last year or so. I've been spending all my time working in the remote exam related software. They're mostly doing paper, and I think they're actually just printing a unique exam for every applicant and tell the applicant, you can write on the exam, that's fine, we're just going to throw it away afterwards. And every single one is completely unique, just as secure as the computer one. And then you just grade it with a smartphone. And all of the VEs have a smartphone. They sign in, they go onto the GradeCam page, they hold it there. It takes a few seconds. It scans it, takes a picture of the form, so you've got a picture of the answer sheet, and records it exactly the same way it would a computerized exam. And these days, since we made the changes for the remote exams, it does all of the paperwork for you. So you do digital signatures, you sign online, like with a mouse or something. Your signature may look ugly, but it doesn't matter because it's a valid legal signature. Everything can be emailed. And the FCC rules say that the VEC has to keep the originals. Well, if the originals are electronic, then the originals are electronic, and that's all you keep. There's no longer a need to send the paper. You can just send it all entirely electronically. And it's verifiable, and you have exam history, and you've got so at this point you can get the data to the VEC and the license submitted so much faster. Some of the smaller VECs that don't have as much process that they have to go through were before the FCC started charging fees. They were getting licenses issued an hour after they took the exam, as long as it wasn't on a weekend.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. So how did COVID-19 change examinations for amateur radio licensing?
So when COVID started, it was I was actually gearing up to work on some Hamstudy stuff, trying to add some instructional resources and content to Hamstudy, and trying to find authors to partner with and things like that. And so this kind of derailed my entire life, honestly. I got drawn into a couple of online groups. I try to maintain a presence on Reddit and in some Discord servers. And, I don't have the time to follow everything going on, but I try to be around so that if people have questions about Hamstudy stuff or about my signal stuff antennas or something, that that they can find me. And so I got drawn into some some people who are very motivated to find solutions to the problem of, well, now that we're doing social distancing, how are we going to do amateur radio testing? And there's a number of ways that people address that problem. And honestly, my software works great for all of them. Yay. But but this particular group was very much on the, hey, we need to do remote testing. And so they're starting this discussion about, well, what do we need to do to get the rules changed for remote testing? Well, the thing is I'd already been talking to Larry Bullock at W5YI-VEC for a number of years about that topic. And so I had a lot more information than most of the others did. And I already knew that the rules did not need to be changed. It was actually entirely legal to do remote testing. The problem was one of logistics. It was figuring out and process. It's like, how do we do this? And so then the next question was, well, we need to come up with some software that can be used to administer an exam over the internet. I said, no, that's not a problem. I have that. I wrote that years ago. The problem is, how do we do the rest of it? How do we make sure that at least to a reasonable, extent, there's no cheating? How do we take care of all of the paperwork and stuff? And so we did a lot of, going back and forth. There was a Basecamp software communities collaboration. And then I eventually set up a Discord server, which is where most of the discussion happens now. And it was kind of this task group of people, writing up documentation, writing up proposals, discussing it, and we kind of came down to the conclusion that it's actually not as hard as we had initially thought. There is a lot of kind of annoying process that you have to go through at the beginning, because the first thing you have to do is make sure that the area around the applicant is clean. It's like that there's no windows that somebody might be holding up answers behind, that they're not wearing headphones that somebody could be talking to them through, that they're not running some kind of screen sharing software that somebody else could be actually taking the exam. And we actually caught somebody doing that once. And the FCC, last I heard, was threatening to revoke their license entirely. They did reject the upgrade that they were specifically caught cheating on. But they were, anyway, causing some other shenanigans. But it came down to, it's like, well, I mean, you need to look around the whole area. And people came up with process, documented on how to do this. And then you need to have camera and you need to have screen sharing so you can see exactly what they're doing. And so on March 26th, I believe, 2020, I and two other VEs for W5YI gave what is, as far as I know, the first fully remote exam session that was entirely over the internet. Now, Anchorage VEC had been doing some what I call proctored remote exams, where they did it remote, but they required a trusted, approved proxy proctor to be there monitoring it. And there's a lot of information on that, but I think they've actually switched to using this method as well at this point, and they're using exam tools as well. So the first versions were annoying, but mainly because of all of the paperwork. Like the biggest time suck were things like, I wrote the software to be used on an individual computer, in a lab that you're there physically at. And so in order to start the exam, you type in your password on their computer. Well, if you're going to do that, then either you have to give them your password, which is, not a great idea, or you have to remote control their computer, which now makes it harder to set up the video conferencing and creates all these complications. And then the biggest thing is getting all of the signatures for the 605 and the CSCE, those two forms. And so for a long time, I think most people were using Adobe Sign. And so for every single one, you'd have to set it up for Adobe Sign, which is probably 5 to 10 minutes of work, and then send it out and get the responses, and then send out the final, and then put all the paperwork together. And so it was doable, but it was slow. And at this point, I spent probably 6 weeks where I barely saw my family, my poor wife and kids. And I had a 5-month-old baby at the time. So mostly my poor wife, but just like working practically 24/7 on building out the new stuff. And the biggest differences that were done was the digital signatures. So all the paperwork could be done electronically, and what you might call remote authorization, so that the VEs on their own devices are able to grade the exams and allow people in and, do those behaviors. And so that's, from the software perspective, it was an enormous amount of work to try to do mostly by myself. I did have some people helping as they could in a very short period of time. And it's still, like, to this day, there's a lot that I still want to accomplish with that. But with those changes, it completely changed the landscape of testing, because for about a year to a year and a half, we basically all we had were remote exams that were given over video conferencing, mostly using exam tools, but there are a couple other little systems that have cropped up, and things like parking lot sessions. That was actually, there was at least 3 or 4 groups that I knew of that were doing it. Ours was one of them, doing parking lot sessions, where basically you have everybody stay in their car and you pass paperwork to them. And in our case, we didn't even have to necessarily get the paperwork back. We could scan it through the window. I don't remember if they actually did that or not. But I mean, that really changed things. And to the point that there are now entire VE teams that all they do is remote exams. They don't even do in-person sessions. It's interesting because I often talk to, it's almost like there's two major camps. There's the people that are like, so when are remote exams going to completely stop? And then there's the camp of people that are like, well, so when are in-person exams going to completely stop? And I think the answer is that neither is happening. Remote exams are absolutely here to stay. There's a lot of people that is the only way that they can get to a test session. That's the only way they're going to be able to take an exam. Even if it's annoying because you have to find a clean room. In fact, amusingly, from what I'm told, most people, or one of the most popular locations is a bathroom. People are taking exams in a bathroom because there's nothing in the room that could be used to cheat. And so it's really to clear it out. So, I mean, it sounds weird, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it.
So, Richard, from a practical standpoint, a person's using their own computer or your system or the system that's proctoring the exam. How else are you tracking the user? Is he using his own camera phone as one of the cameras that's keeping track of his activity?
It varies from VEC to VEC a little bit. Some VECs require that the full session has to be recorded. All of the VEs have to have their cameras on so you can tell that everyone is present. And minimum, every VEC and every exam team that I'm aware of has at least one camera on the user and screen sharing on so that you can see all of that. And you'd be surprised at how easy it is to tell what people are looking at when you're just watching them on a screen.
When you're using the camera that's on their screen looking at them.
Yes.
So if their eyes are going off to the side, then you know they're not looking at the screen anymore, they're looking at something else.
Right. And then some VEs also require an additional camera, usually like a smartphone or something, to give them another angle on the applicant. And then, of course, there's, before you start, you first have them use the camera to show you the entire area, to show you behind the screen, to show you the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the desk, to make sure that everything's there. It's important to note that the goal here is not necessarily to make it absolutely impossible for somebody to find a way to cheat, because that's impossible to do. There's no way that you're going to ever be able to prevent every situation. But in most cases, it's probably harder to cheat on a remote exam if the exam team is doing it properly than it is to cheat on an in-person exam, because there's lots of ways that people can do that too.
What is hamstudy.org? Because that's actually how I met you at the Dayton Hamvention. I came to your booth because your father-in-law brought me over and introduced me to you. How did you start hamstudy.org, and what is it?
So one of the reasons that we process so many applicants with our exam session is because not only does my father-in-law do the monthly test session, he also does a monthly cram course. And so originally it was kind of we were using some software for helping people study on those that was not as the licensing was not as clear that it was legal to use it the way we were using it as I felt like it needed to be. I wasn't the one making the decisions on that, and it's possible that he had license agreements to do that. But regardless, I wanted to have something different, and so after I got permission to do our own testing software from W5YI, I said, well, as long as I've got this, go ahead and make a practice exam software as well. And so I built something that did practice exams and had you could study. You could have it either make you a full practice exam, or you could have it give you a, just one section or one sub-element at a time. And that seemed to work pretty well. And then as I saw people using that, I realized that it wasn't actually super efficient. And here I'll take a little bit of an aside. The most common way that I see people recommending people to study is by taking a practice exam. Now, first of all, I'm not going to take a stance on whether you should pass the exam by memorizing questions or pass the exam by studying. I've known people who've done both methods. I've done both methods myself. I basically memorized the extra pool. I studied for 3.5 hours using what's basically the far predecessor of Hamstudy, where I just had the questions with the correct answers highlighted, and I read through it for 3.5 hours, and I passed the amateur extra license exam. Didn't understand any of it at the time. I mean, I understand most of it now. Not all of it, but probably as much as most extras, or maybe even more than some. Who knows? But the point is, I've seen people do both methods, and I've seen people who really learned and never did anything with ham radio. And I've seen people who did the memorization method and then found mentors to help make sure they weren't doing anything illegal, learned by doing, and became extremely productive members of the community. Both can work. I think it's better to learn, but I don't care personally if you learn before or after. But Hamstudy came because however you are learning, it's really, really inefficient to just take practice tests. Even if you're memorizing, taking practice tests is awful. To give you an idea, I have run a simulation where 10,000 different times it just took practice exams, random practice exams, until all of the questions had been seen a single time. Not learned, just seen once. In 10,000 iterations, 44 was the minimum number of practice exams that you had to see to see every question once. And on average, it was about 76 times. And the most common, so we're looking at mean, median, mode, right? Most common, the mode was 68. So say you're going to have to probably take at least 68 practice exams just to see every question a single time. So that's on the 2022 technician practice exam. If you look at the general, it goes way up, where you're going to take at least 82 to 91 exams on average, meaning that half of everyone could actually take longer than that just to see everything once. That's not going to let you learn it. That's not going to let you memorize it. That's just to see it.
How many questions are on the technician class test?
35 questions. And the way that those work is there's 35 sections in the exam, in the exam pool, and you take one question at random from every section. Now, the biggest section has, I think, 14 questions in it. Definitely in the last pool. I don't remember, but I think on this pool as well. 14 questions, which means that in theory, you could take 14 practice exams if it was always getting new questions. And so that was my first attempt, as I thought, all I have to do is make something that is, and I called it a smart exam, that will be able to give them a unique exam each time that does not repeat questions. And I did that. And then one of the times that I was at my father-in-law's cram course, I saw a lady break down in tears because she had just taken 10 exams and did not feel like she was making any progress at all. Like zero progress. I've been testing for 2 hours and I'm not getting any better, which if you think about it makes perfect sense because there's a minimum of 11 questions in every section. It means she took 10 exams. She hadn't seen any question twice yet.
Right. Just the sheer volume is overwhelming.
On the one hand, it's not that the pool is not that big, but on the other hand, when you look at it from that perspective, it is emotionally devastating to go for that long with no positive feedback. And so that kind of led into what has become Hamstudy's study mode. And, and all of this is kind of the feedback that I'm using as I change things. So I got rid of the smart exams, despite the fact that at least a couple dozen times since then, people have told me that they really wish it had that. I'm not bringing it back. And instead, what I did is I created the study mode, which is still mostly geared around, learning the questions. It's not an instructional resource. But what it does is it tracks how you're doing and how difficult each question is for you based on your prior experience. And it's using a logarithmic difficulty scale so that, even if you guess something right, it's still going to ask it again. It's not going to just never see it again because you got it right once. But the assumption is that if you could guess it right once, it's still easier than a question that you guessed wrong, right? Or that you didn't guess and got wrong.
I'm just curious, Richard, does this mean that, let's say you're studying a paragraph on SWR, for example. does that mean that there could be multiple questions pulled from that same paragraph? And so if you actually understand the paragraph of information, that you could actually be able to answer a few questions that were pulled into the question pool from that paragraph. Is that kind of where you're going?
Not entirely. So the first thing, there's a fundamental assumption that is incorrect there. And that is that the questions are pulled from paragraphs somewhere, and they're not. There is no document and source that questions are geared around. There is instructional content that is geared around the questions. And I don't care how dedicated you are to teaching instead of memorizing. That's always going to be, at least to some extent, the case, because you're still going to have to. I mean, we're talking about electrical and RF engineering. There is not to mention rules and regulations, there is an infinite, or practically infinite, number of topics and subtopics in there that you could choose to put in the question pool. And so the question pool committee, which is part of NCVEC, has to try to decide what questions are going to be most relevant, what things are going to best help ensure that people know how to operate safely and how to operate correctly, and just generally, legally, and what all of this is. And so they work very hard to do that, and they get a lot of criticism. A lot of people think they do a good job. A lot of people think they do a bad job. I'm not even going to address that. The point is just that is where it comes from, and that is what they're doing, essentially. And so, but my point is just that without trying to connect those questions in any way, there is a very simple mathematical way to say, based on how many times you've seen this question before and how you did on that, here's an approximate, an approximate numerical value that represents how well you seem to know that question based on that experience. And using that, I can then say, well, this is the next question that you need to see. And that choosing the next question basically works by saying, how have you been doing? If you're missing a lot of questions, I'm going to give you some of the easier questions, which in practical terms means I'm going to let you review now for a little bit. And if you're getting all of them right, then I'm going to say, well, this is going to get boring for you, so let me give you some harder questions, which in practical terms means questions that are totally new, or questions that you've never gotten correctly, or questions that you have missed a whole lot, even though you did get it correctly once, or, but using that numerical scale. And then that numerical scale is also exposed to the user in a weighted average. It could be thought of as a weighted average, basically, as the aptitude score. And so Hamstudy, the great thing about it is that it works with any study method.
You're reading the handbook. You've taken to reading the handbook, and now you've decided you're going to take the test questions.
Right. And the thing is that, studies are very, very clear. You learn best by learning and then having that learning reinforced by quizzing, being quizzed. It's one of the most effective ways to learn. And so even if you're going to do that, you should still find a resource like Hamstudy. I recommend Hamstudy personally, but find one like Hamstudy, something that is going to pay attention to how you're doing and guide you to the right thing. Or at the very least, take your practice test and figure out how am I doing in, where am I missing the most questions? And Hamstudy tries to help facilitate that as well with the practice exams, so that I can see, where do I focus my study? What is going to be best for me to focus on in order to make sure that I understand this material?
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. How much time does a would-be technician class licensee, how much time will he spend on the average with Hamstudy before he's ready to take the exam?
I'm not sure that there's actually a good way of measuring that. Certainly, I don't have enough information, both because I don't track how much time you spend on the site. I could draw some conclusions based on, I do have timestamps on recorded blocks of answers, so I could try to extrapolate some averages there. But I also don't collect enough information to link users to their exam results. But anecdotally, I have seen people who've taken months, and I've seen people who've done it in under an hour.
Based on that they may already have some background information.
It depends on reading comprehension. It depends on their basic understanding of the material. It depends on a lot of things. And I'm actually in the process. One of my next things is I want to make. So Hamstudy also has crowdsourced explanations for all of the questions. So when you miss a question, even though the format is somewhat more conducive, it sort of naturally encourages you to do the memorization route. But we do have explanations, so that once you miss something, or if you guessed right and you just don't really understand it, you can click on the website. It's in the corner of the card, or on the app. There's an explain button in the corner. I guess it's in the top right corner of the card either way. It just looks different. And it will flip over, and then there's an explanation that some other user or combination of users have provided to help you understand that. And I'm looking at ways to expand that to where it can kind of act more as a full instructional resource to kind of teach and quiz you at the same time. So that's something I've wanted to do for a long time. It's finding the right format to do that, because at this point we have to tie in business concerns, and I'm not a good enough technical author to write all of that myself, even if I had time, which I don't. So I've got to find, people to partner with in order to do that. But I've got I'm hoping that it's not in the too distant future, that I really feel like that would be the ideal training method for a lot of cases. But in the meantime, I've just tried to build something that enables people to do that anyway. And so there's a lot of people who just use Hamstudy and just memorize in order to get their license. And if that works for them, and if they stay in the hobby and they learn, that's great. It is a sad fact that a lot of those people are probably going to then set it aside and think that, oh, well, I ordered a cheap radio off of Amazon, I've got my license, and so now in a disaster situation, I'll be set. And in reality, they're going to be completely lost because they won't know how to find anyone to talk to. They won't know how to use their radio. The radio won't be charged. You have to use this stuff in order to understand it either way. But at the end of the day, the exam is only a small part of bringing somebody into the hobby. And so what I'm trying to do is I identified that as an area where I can help, and an area where I understand how to build software to use the data, which is freely available, which is easy to use, and which can provide that, can make that easier. The user still has to put in the effort. They still have to put in the time. And I try to make sure to emphasize that anytime somebody says, oh, hey, it's only thanks to Hamstudy that I got my license. Well, no, that's not true. I'd like to think that we helped, that we made it easier, but it's thanks to the fact that you put in the time and effort and you did it. That's why you got your license.
Let me ask a question, Richard. You were talking about a very large volume of people that are coming through the Hamstudy courses there in Utah, and even, after the pandemic, you have people taking these examinations virtually. What is your organization doing then once a person passes? They pass it, they get their CSCE, or they get the acknowledgement that they've passed and that they have a license in a couple of days. What is the follow-up process that you guys do or that you recommend in order so that those people don't drop through the cracks? I think there's something like almost 800,000 ham radio operator licensees in North America, and yet the majority of them are not on the air. What do you guys do?
So first, I should clarify that the local test group is not mine. I assist them. It's not involved with Hamstudy in any direct way other than that I'm involved with them and I am Hamstudy, I suppose. We have a couple of local groups that are excellent. The Utah Valley Amateur Radio Club has actually only been around for 4 or 5 years. That's another of those things that I got dragged into to helping found. So I'm on the board of directors. Mostly, I think, because through Hamstudy and Signal stuff, a lot of people know who I am, and I guess they respect my opinion on some things at least. And so we've, but it's an interesting club because it actually grew to over 1,000 people within 6 months to a year, but largely because it doesn't try to be entirely an in-person group. There's a Facebook group for the club. We don't actually collect any dues. All of the actual club resources are donated, and it's all entirely volunteer on everything. And it's mostly just it provides a forum. It provides a monthly meeting where people can go to ask questions and to learn. It provides a forum through Facebook. Unfortunately, that was the only real communication medium we could find that seems to support this. So people who don't like Facebook are kind of excluded there a little bit. We also have a Google group, which is basically never used, but it gives people a little bit of a network where they can reach out, that if they want to learn how to do this, they can ask questions, they can get suggestions. There's also the local ARES group, the Utah County ARES, UCARES, that helps with a lot of events, puts on a lot of events, and is always soliciting volunteers to help with these different events. And so largely it's kind of a question. I think if what you're really asking is how do we help people once they get their license to stay into the hobby, to get into the hobby, I would say a lot of it depends on that person, and it depends on helping them understand, why are you doing this? Why are you getting licensed? If somebody is getting licensed purely because, well, somebody told me I ought to, and that's all it stays, then they're probably not going to stay very, very involved. So it's a question of finding what is interesting to you. I mean, in this area, there are people who really like HF, so there's some HF nets, and there's people who are into HF and can help you get started with that. There are some 2-meter nets. We actually have a family history net on our club repeater every Saturday night, because some of the group thought that'd be fun, and so they do it every week. We had a youth net, we had a women's net, just ways to try to reach out to some of those demographics, especially the demographics that are kind of traditionally less well supported. But it's a question of, what is interesting to you? Is it emergency preparedness? If so, find some emergency preparedness groups that you can learn from, and some tasks to do, set some goals, set some things to try, and find ways to use it. If it's, if you're like me and you like playing with technology, maybe you want to see if there's an Eridan or mesh networking group in your area. I'm connected to 2 different wireless networks from Ubiquity equipment that I have on my roof, which connect kind of throughout the valley. Well, one of them connects throughout the valley. The other one is actually connected to it's a kind of a semi-private, as private as you're allowed to be on ham radio, network between the mountaintop sites that we have repeaters at. And so that I have, there's 3 or 4 repeaters that I maintain. There should be 4, but right now there's 3, which I'm able to remotely access the controller for and do some work using that. And we can also link them over that wireless network. And that lets us do some things with those that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. So when we do events, like I've got an event coming up on Saturday that's a 100K ultra marathon that I help out with every year. And there are stations that cannot get into most of the normal repeaters, but they can get to a repeater that's only accessible in a canyon, which is able to shoot a wireless link over the top of another mountain into one of the main repeaters in the valley, and we can link those 2 up. And so that lets us expand that network into the area of the canyon that we couldn't get to otherwise. I mean, this is just an example of some of the things that I find interesting. The real key is to find what aspect of the hobby, because there's a zillion of them, I counted, which aspect of the hobby is interesting to you or to this person, and then make sure that you've got some kind of a support network. Make sure that you're not just alone in it, because any hobby which centers around communications is not going to go anywhere without communication.
That's actually a very wise thing. Let me ask another question, if you don't mind. From your perspective, what do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
I'm not even sure how to answer that. To be honest, I think even trying too hard to answer that may be a little bit self-defeating. There's a lot of challenges facing amateur radio. There's anything from apathy to rudeness to intolerance of minority groups to, I know people who are really focused on all of those things. I think the best we can do is, those of us who are really trying to build the hobby, is instead of trying to say, oh, well, I have to find the biggest thing to, the biggest weakness Instead, look for where is the place that I can help the most, and where can I contribute the most, and where do I feel the most at home, and can I help to build everybody else up? I've chosen to do that mostly in the amateur radio testing area with both exam preparation and administration. And I've been working on that for a very long time. And it's only since COVID hit that a lot of that has really just suddenly taken off. I mean, we went from maybe 15 to 20 groups using us total to last estimate I saw was somewhere between 30 and 50% of all amateur radio license exams in the United States over the last 2.5 years have gone through exam tools. And that's a pretty big change in just 2 years, I don't know what would be the thing, to try to narrow it down to one thing. I'm not sure how to do that, I think.
Let me ask a different question then. You're a young person who's become an amateur radio operator. You're 39 years old. I think that's what you said. And you're excited by the hobby. Are you excited by the hobby because of the contribution that you make, which is certainly an important one? Or if you were trying to sell ham radio to your children, for example, first of all, do you sell ham radio to your children, or do you have to sell ham radio to your children? Are any of them interested and involved? And are the messages that you are sending, are those the messages that they want to hear?
So I do talk about ham radio with my children. My oldest is 13. Caleb is interested. In fact, all of my kids who are old enough to know what it is have said that they're interested, but they also haven't quite had the concentration. And part of it is honestly probably that I haven't had the time to spend one-on-one with them teaching to get their licenses so far. I expect that they will at some point. Caleb is actually, so I also sell antennas. A lot of the stuff that I'm doing here is actually funded by these antennas that I sell through signalstuff.com. And my son Caleb has been kind of slowly taking over most of the shipping for that. He's only 13, so I watch over him and help him. But my kids all know that ham radio is a big part of my life and a big part of what I do. But from my perspective, I think the most compelling aspect of ham radio is the emergency communications aspect. It's we have very clear, visible evidence that there is a weakness in the overall infrastructure that if something goes wrong, this is going to be the only thing that's still there. And to me, that is the most compelling aspect. And a lot of the core of what I do ends up being kind of focused around that to some extent or another.
Are these events that you support with amateur radio, do the kids participate in those events as well so that they can actually maybe feel a part of this support, even though they may not have their ham radio licenses yet? Are they with you?
I have not brought any of them so far. I probably will start bringing Caleb along before too long. A lot of that is because I felt like I don't really have the time while I'm doing them. I end up getting shoehorned into kind of leadership positions or management positions. My brother, Ray KD7RMX, and I have built a computer program that we use to track the running at where the runners are at these events and upload it to the internet. And so I end up spending so much of my time focused on those that I'm concerned that I may not be able to help my kids as much as I need to. So it's something that I need to do better at, honestly, is helping to bring them in and get them more involved. And that may be part of why they're not licensed yet. But there's certainly a lot of room to do so. And when I was first licensed, that's what got the rest of my family, kind of involved. Is first we got my father back active again. Shortly after I got my license, he upgraded to his extra and changed his call sign, and then we started getting some radios, and then we helped out with the Jamboree. And then as things continued on, my older brother got his license, and arguably met his wife through ham radio too, believe it or not. And then my youngest brother and sister got licensed, maybe a few years later. I think they were only 12 or 13 when they got licensed. It took my sister, I think, 4 or 5 tries before she passed it, but she did. And then my other younger sister, I don't remember exactly where she got her license, but at this point, I have 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and all but my older sister are licensed. They don't necessarily use their licenses often at this point, but when I was a teenager, we would help out with events. And there's actually still a shorter race that is sometimes basically staffed just entirely by my immediate family, because the guy who runs it is a neighbor of my parents. And so we kind of do it to help out, and we often don't plan ahead as well as we should, but it doesn't require a lot of people, just enough to kind of relay things down the canyon into from the start area where you can't get cell phones into, and make sure that nobody's hurt, or if anybody collapses from heat exhaustion, which has happened before, that we're able to make sure somebody can pick them up and get them down, and things like that. So I mean, growing up, there were a lot of things like that I participated in. My kids are a little younger than I was at that point, but Caleb is getting there, and I probably should get him more involved.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
From a directly personal perspective, honestly, it's the testing. This is something I've felt. My first interaction with testing felt like, wow, why are with this hobby that we're so focused on technology, why is everything so out of date? And that was 25 years ago, and most things still work the same way, or they have until this last couple of years. And I find it incredibly exciting to finally see some of the stuff I've been working on start to take off, start to get used, and people getting excited about it and seeing that it's solving problems, that it's helping people. It's one of those funny things that in a lot of ways these days, I feel like I spend so much of my time helping people get into the hobby that I don't actually do as much with the hobby myself. Part of that is time. I've spent so much time over the last couple of years, especially with getting exam tools to the point that it's at now. I feel like now I'm way behind on where I want Hamstudy to be, because there's a lot more I'd like to improve on that. I guess I'm a bit of a facilitator, kind of just like with software. I enjoy building frameworks and building tools that other developers use. They say I'm the programmer's programmer, the programmer that builds things for the programmers. So to a certain extent, I guess I'm kind of the ham's ham. I'm the ham that sets things up for others to use.
I feel your pain.
I maintain local repeaters, and I help with making sure that the websites are up for the local club, and I'm one of the tech support guys that they call if when they're having problems and stuff.
But the radio doesn't work in your car. That's where I'm at these days, right?
The radio in my car does actually.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
However, I do have a 40-meter dipole on my roof, which broke a year and a half ago, and I haven't fixed it yet.
I understand exactly. What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Find what you're interested in and pursue it and learn. If you want to be in the hobby, you need to not just want to be in the hobby. You need to want to do something that is in the hobby. And there are so many options. And if you're just looking for something interesting, then that's great too. So look around, find what's interesting. Also, make sure that you have some kind of a group that you belong to, some kind of a group, somewhere that you can reach out for help and for collaboration. And maybe for a lot of us, maybe somewhere that you can reach out and help other people. Because I think that, to me at least, it's the ability to help others is actually more important to me in belonging to a community than the ability to get help myself in most cases.
Right. I think there's a need, maybe it's a human need, that we want to be significant and contribute to whatever group we're in.
I agree.
I'm so glad that I had this opportunity to invite you on QSO today and have you share this information with my audience. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
All right, 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Richard. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KD7BBC in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in September. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.